Joining me now is our panel, NBC senior political editor Mark Murray, Washington Post political reporter Eugene Scott, former New York Congressman Joe Crowley, and Republican strategist Sarah Chamberlain. Thanks to all of you for being here. Joe, let me start with you. I want to get to what Mitch McConnell had to say in just a second. We'll get to the Republican blame game. But let's talk about the Democrats. Obviously had better than expected midterms. Right. However, they had some tough races in New York. They missed a chance to pick up some seats. What are the lessons for Democrats? Because the map only gets tougher in 2024.
Well, I think a lot of those seats that we lost this year are going to come back in 2 years.
Okay, you heard it here first.
Those are Democratic seats, I think. You heard it here first. It's always time for introspective. I think, to look back and see what we did wrong, what we did right. Let's not forget that Kathy Hochul did win. And she won okay, but I think she didn't have the coattails that folks were looking for, particularly in those suburban areas of Long Island and then the Hudson Valley. And I think part of this is because of the over-aggressive approach to reapportionment that the legislature took. And so I do think, that Zeldin himself, I gave credit to him, that he was very effective in terms of the crime issue, real or perceived. It was there and it was real to people. Yeah, because I was going to say, should Democrats have focused more on economy and crime and some of those issues? I mean, was that, part of what dragged them down? Sarah, what are your takeaways? What do you think the lessons are for Republicans heading into 2024?
We have to work together as a party to run the right candidates in the right seats. I mean, Republican Main Street Partnership, we won 12 out of the 15 seats that were added on Tuesday night and continue to be added. But we have to pick the right candidates, and we have to work with the MAGA people to do that.
That the quality of candidates matter. What Mitch McConnell is saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mark, you and I talked kind of in the days leading up to it, and you were very clear. These races are tight and anything can happen. I mean, you said that from the outset, and so now we have those results. What surprised you most?
The independents ended up breaking for a lot of the Democratic candidates. I think there was this assumption that in this environment with a president whose job rating is in the low 40s, and whose ratings hadn't been all that strong with independents throughout the whole cycle, that at the end of the day, that the undecided, the persuadables would break the GOPs, because that's normally what ends up happening during a midterm cycle. But interestingly enough, the middle of the electorate broke to Democrats, or actually more accurately, broke against the more Trump kind of aligned Republicans, because we did see people like Brian Kemp, for example, in Georgia do really well with independent voters. We ended up seeing, Greg Abbott in Texas do as well. The Republicans that had distance from the former president did very well, but the Democrats really capitalized with the other ones in the middle of the election.
Yeah, and Walker underperformed in a number of key areas where Brian Kemp was. Eugene, we are expecting former President Trump to make a big announcement. By all accounts, he's going to announce that he's running for re-election. How does that shake up this current political moment that we are in right now?
Well, if you listen to some Republican leaders, it could cost Republicans this Georgia race. Chris Sununu has come out and said that announcing this early could mobilize Democrats to vote against Trump. Everyone's talking about how unpopular Biden is. Trump is even more unpopular, especially with voters who do not consistently back GOP candidates. So him reminding people of the America that existed when he was in the White House could lead voters to say, we don't want to see any more of that.
Sarah, what do you make of that? And does it freeze the field to some extent?
Yes, it sure does. I think Trump, it is a disaster for him to announce before Georgia. We know what he did last time in the Georgia seats. We lost control. And, we've already lost control, but we could stand to pick up one more seat with Herschel Walker.
We are hearing new sound from former Vice President Mike Pence about Donald Trump and what he said and did on January 6th. I want to play a little bit of that and then get everyone's reaction on the other side.
It angered me. But I turned to my daughter, who was standing nearby, and I said, it doesn't take courage to break the law. It takes courage to uphold the law. I mean, the president's words were reckless. It was clear he decided to be part of the problem.
Mark, I've been talking to folks close to the former vice president who say he's getting into the race regardless of what Mr. Trump does. I mean, what are you expecting in terms of the Republican field, in terms of a Vice President Mike Pence announcing his candidacy potentially? He hasn't made a decision yet.
To Sarah's point, I mean, former President Donald Trump getting in has an impact on other people. People might end up saying, if this were wide open, I'd actually run. And some people decide, that why have to deal with something like that? But, I mean, if former Vice President Mike Pence gets in, if Ron DeSantis, it will be, but there's also some costs coming with it that, as we ended up seeing in 2016 or even 2020, the insults that come your way just to be able to withstand a lot of the pressure. And one of Donald Trump's superpowers is he mucks up the entire process. And there are a lot of people who might not have the appetite for that kind of muck up it.
Yeah. Joe, it's interesting. I was just talking to Congressman-elect Wiley Nickel. I asked him, would he support House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in a leadership position again, whether Democrats have the majority or a minority. He didn't want to answer that and wouldn't say if he thought that President Biden was the strongest candidate to run again in 2024. I think that it's notable that a number of Democrats just are not ready to say that they back President Biden again in 2024. And as Eugene is saying, it speaks to the fact that he's also been quite weakened over these past 2 years.
Well, I've been in that position before when I was a freshman, and you enter a new realm of competition, and that's House leadership races. Yeah. And everyone is on you constantly. They want your vote, and it's a pretty intense thing. So when it comes to the House leadership, I understand where he's coming from. I think when it comes to Joe Biden had a really good week. And he goes off the COP and he talks about, the big issues of world concern. He's very, presidential. I think he had a super week. Republicans didn't in that respect. Look, I think Joe Biden, if he runs, he's going to get the support he needs.
All right. Eugene, let's talk about House leadership. Kevin McCarthy, he's waiting to see if Republicans do, in fact, take control of the House. But he could have a real fight on his hands. And once it's all been decided, it's going to be tough for him to corral his caucus, regardless of what he's trying to get done.
It will be difficult, obviously, because Republicans aren't winning the seats yet that they expected to win. But it'll also be difficult because we're seeing some far-right Republicans come out and speak out, being very vocal. Matt Gaetz, I believe Bob Good, saying that they really don't think that Kevin McCarthy has what it takes to take this Republican Congress to the next level of whatever it is in terms of policy and future and whatever the goals are. It's been interesting, though. I believe today Marjorie Taylor Greene has come out and said that she actually supports Kevin McCarthy and making a break from the far-right lawmakers.
That was very notable. Sarah, what do you make of the fight that Kevin McCarthy is facing?
It is a huge fight. The Republican Main Street Partnership is right in the middle of it. We have 88 members, so we'll have 88 votes, and he is calling all of our members. All of our members are talking to each other. We are with Kevin and hope he wins.
Do you think he will? I mean, I think that, again, you have all of these knives out for him. It is very notable that Marjorie Taylor Greene came out and said, let's hold on a minute.
Well, she met with him for 45 minutes last week. So I'm sure there was some type of deal cut there, which Kevin has to do.
Yeah. What do you think they want from him, and what is he willing to give to get?
I think they want from him to be able to, one member of Congress, vote him out of speakerhood. I can't think of the name of that legislation. Help me. The bill that I'm...
Yes, to be able to
remove. Thank you. I think that's what they want, but the Republican Main Street Partnership members do not want that, and they're going to try to give Kevin some cover on that.
Yeah. Mark, talk about the fight that's playing out there and also potentially for Speaker Pelosi.
Well, so on the Republican side, even if they end up getting the majority, it's going to be the most fragile majority since 1931. And just a little history lesson, that 72nd Congress right before FDR's election in 1932, Republicans entered in with a 218 to 216 majority. Wow. There were 14 deaths that ended up spurring special elections. Democrats took control of the House and then had the landslide victory that FDR had in 1932. And so with fragile majorities, anything could end up happening and potentially changing the balance of power. And the same thing would be true for Nancy Pelosi and for Democrats, too. I mean, this would be just having a majority on the knife's edge for either party, which will just create something that we haven't seen in close to 100 years.
What a great history lesson, Mark. Thank you for that. Joe, talk broadly speaking, because Mark's talking about the narrow margins that will exist. And I was just, again, talking to Congressman-elect Nickel. He had some optimism that they could actually find some common ground, but a lot of people are worried this is just going to be gridlock.
Well, I think once we know who actually does run the House, and it is trending towards Republicans, we believe, I think that's why there's a lot of talk about in this lame duck session that they address the debt ceiling issue. It's kind of like Kevin McCarthy saying, guys, please take this off my plate. And at the same time, he'll be rallying against them at the same time. But that's, because you cannot run a government like this, especially with those small margins and people denying the votes when you need them most.
Okay. Thank you. Fantastic panel. Really appreciate it. A lot to unpack on this Monday. That's for sure.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.